Whatever Romulus and Remus might have to say about it, children raised by wolves or wild dogs or other natural beings don't learn to speak. The ability in human beings to speak seems to disappear if a child isn't exposed to language at a certain age. In fact, children who aren't exposed to certain sounds of certain languages at a young age seem to never pick up those sounds either in speech or in being able to hear them properly rather than hearing a different sound in its place. Human beings also have a distinct number of sounds which we can speak and which we can understand. The International Phonetic Alphabet is testament to this, which not only shows all sounds which human beings do make, but all sounds which human beings could make and could comprehend. Of course, the alphabet might be updated from time to time, but it gives us an idea of this finite thing in human expression and human understanding. There are only so many sounds, and there are likely also only so many concepts in the base sort of meaning of a concept, in the way of the language of the brain or the mind, rather than in the more complex sort of mixtures of concepts that we create as language and speech. People who are raised by animals never really fit into civilization, and people who are kept in solitary confinement in jails tend to have a terrible time about it. It seems to be one of the worst tortures known to man, and it seems to affect their ability to interact with other people afterwards very negatively. People who are kept in isolation from others often go mad, and in certain instances where people are denied stimulus and kept in darkness with only their own mind to interact with, they start hallucinating as the mind attempts to create something which would have some sort of sensory input, some sort of interaction with an outside world. The idea that people who get stuck in the wild start seeing people who aren't there is not something which is unheard of. It's something which seems to be innate in human experience, that we have a need to be a social being. If human beings were to give birth at a stage where their young could walk about and move as other mammals often do, pregnancy would have to be extended for a much longer time, and the human brain would not fit through the mother's special part to come out into the world, for the simple reason that it would be too big. As it is, it has to come through in a not completely hard skull which comes through, and a woman's hips have widened over time in order to allow it. The idea that human beings at some stage came together to make some sort of agreement, some sort of social contract, that they would enter into civilization when human beings only exist within civilization in the sense of a speaking, interacting person, is not something which we can talk about as something which sounds real. Yes, you might have certain instances of certain social contracts being created in history, but you don't have a social contract creating law or society in general. That just isn't something historic, because human beings were never not in some sort of civilization or society. Now, you can talk about human beings being in less centralized forms of society. You can talk about the fact that early humans might have interacted in small clans with family groups or larger. But let's look at that for a moment, and let's look at what law is. Now, in a practical sense, if you want to define law, you define it as the monopolization on the regulation of the use of force within a society. Now, I could say the legitimate use of force, but that simply relates to what the state controls, and it's not a very practical definition. So, what happens when you reach the age of 2? You might have learned, or you might now learn the word mine. You don't want to share things. Even if you possess something and you let it go, you still consider it to be yours, and you will fight and throw temper tantrums to determine it being yours. And these temper tantrums often appeal to someone who has control of the use of force within the family, either the mother or the father or both. they are the ones who are appealed to because they can take the toy away and the child cannot resist that. They can punish the child in some way or other, whether sending them to their room or in many countries, giving them a hiding, as it might be called. A parent takes that role, but the child already understands property. It already understands the idea of something being yours even if it is not in your possession. So again, this argument which you have from Lockean type classical liberals that I possess my own body, and because I am my own possession and own myself, that which I create with my body I should also own, is not any sort of argument which occurs in the real world. What happens in the real world is people determine that certain things are their territory, their property, and just as speech likely came from our ancestors from before a stage where we started pruning out the means to understand language or different sounds of language, the idea of territory almost certainly comes from our deep ancestral basis, for the simple reason that almost every sort of mammal or creature or being, even a lobster, would understand the idea of its territory and what belongs to it. Even if it doesn't possess it, that's what it would fight and do violence to protect. That's what it would use force to make sure it was its, even if that entails simply pushing something away instead of harming it. Your territory is that which is yours, whether or not you're currently in possession of it. And it's yours because you're prepared to use force to protect it. But in this case of a child, whether that force is legitimate or not is determined by the parent. And in the case of an extended family, it would be determined by a patriarch, by the head of the tribe, or by a council of elders. And in the case of a city, it would be determined by those in the city-state who control it. And as each of these structures come together, as families decide it makes more sense to ally with certain other families, and as tribes decide it makes more sense to ally with other tribes, and as cities decide that their defense is a much better situation if they ally with other cities, and as certain individuals, warlords, conquer and control, you have a society emerge, and in each case, a specific person or group of people takes control of the monopoly on the regulation of the use of force. They're the ones who determine where force may be used and may not be used. As I have argued in the past, almost all nations accept that the death penalty is just, at least in the case of self-defense. By the fact that the state does not prevent someone from committing self-defense, the fact that someone does not get punished for doing so, means that that state, in that case, says that it is morally right in terms of the legislation's morality for that person to enact the death penalty upon another individual. That's because the state regulates the use of force. It might do other things with these regulatory powers. It might extract from the population. It might create an empire, or the leader might become a despot. But they are the ones who, in a practical sense, have overall control of the use of force. And you'll notice that in many nations, the ability to give a hiding to a child might be limited, in some cases entirely, by the state, which is an indication of the sort of practical power the state has. It has power over those below it to regulate force, and those below it, such as a parent, might have power over those below them, such as their child, in the way that they regulate the use of force. So the idea of law and the idea of something of the state existing for the purposes of some philosophical reason rather than from something innate in human nature is perhaps something which is incorrect, because there is always going to be the idea of territory among human beings. Most of us will consider our own bodies to be our territory. Not all necessarily, but most of us would. And many of us would consider certain property of ours to be our territory, something that we would fight to keep control of, fight to keep our ability to control it. And if you look at things like human rights, it's almost always surrounded things which involve the idea of territory, the things which one creates as one's own that one will fight for in order for one to survive. So in this sort of sense, there's, at least when it comes to nations and when it comes to bodies which control other people, there's almost always a nexus, a matrix, a sort of body upon which all law is based, which is why nations often have such similar laws. Because the problem that law deals with, the fact that the use of force is necessary for survival, is a problem which all of these places deal with. You will always have things which make someone angry enough or defensive enough to kill or to use force and other means. And so force, where it is permitted, takes a side, and where it is prohibited, takes a side. You might not always see those laws written in the statute, but that law is always apparent in what is allowed or not allowed. If you allow the use of self-defense to prevent rape, you are saying not only that rape is wrong, obviously, but you're also giving the victim the right to use force against the rapist. You are in fact allowing a sort of application of law to protect a person's rights. If I'm allowed to use force to prevent someone from killing me, then I am permitted to execute on behalf of the state. It might not be that in an official sense or in general, but in certain circumstances I'd be given that right, because that's the sense in which law really exists. It's this regulation of force. And wherever there can be regulation of force, even in the case of the complexities of company law, what causes someone to go to court? It's because they can't negotiate to a settlement. It's because they can't mediate to a settlement. It's because there's no other solution. And if people were living within an anarchist type of society, they would then perhaps fight in order to use force on the other person. So you have this sort of concept. Now, in philosophy, people love to say that you cannot get an ought from a statement of fact. You cannot get a statement that you must do a certain thing. But that sort of misunderstands the human brain, because the human brain does work with ought all the time. It uses it for games, as more modern answers that philosophy has answered. You can say, if you want to play chess, you ought to play it in a certain way. If you want to avoid arrest, you ought to do certain things within society. If you want to avoid having force used against you, you ought to do certain things. If you want to live, you ought to eat or drink. You ought to do things which will allow you to do that. And the things you can do in order to achieve a specific goal are very specific. And ultimately, there are specific decisions which you can make as an individual society, which will make most societies appear very similar in certain natures. For instance, is life sacred? If you answer yes, then life is probably more important than the suffering which people endure in life inevitably. If, however, suffering is something which must be brought to an utter end, then the human race needs to be brought to an utter end. That's the antinatalist argument, which exists today and has increased its popularity, as people say that because people experience trauma and injury and pain, that humanity should be wiped out to prevent this from occurring. And you'll see increasing policy changes in certain parts of the world which endorse more of a view that pain and suffering is an ultimate evil which must be stopped, rather than life being an ultimate good, in the sense of human life, or the life of yourself, or your gene pool, such as your family, or your nation, and so forth, which is the evolutionary sort of perspective of human beings will be altruistic to protect their genes, to allow people who share some degree of their genome to continue, which is where most people, at least, would say that the human race should be something which is important to continue, even if it brings risk to themselves. Though not all people. There are many people who might believe that merely the world should continue existing without humanity. That's quite a common argument which is made on the antinatalist side, and often the same people will be consistent in their position and will also support things like euthanasia and abortion, while people on the side of life being sacred and continuing the genome of humanity, of yourself, of your brother or sister, and of your family line, extending to your tribe, and extending beyond that to your nation and to humanity as a whole, might in fact take this different approach of saying life is important and that must be sustained. So if you have very specific things that you're aiming for, you suddenly have oughts emerge. The perspective of life being very important is where you get the oughts emerging of Western society, at least historically. Ideas such as human rights are connected to the fact that in order to survive, we need to have a territory. We need to have the territory of our bodies. We need to have the territory of the things we own. Even in communist societies, while you don't have private property, you do have personal property. The bread which you took in the bread line after waiting for it, the toothbrush which you own, is your personal property, even if it's not private property. So this idea of property existing, this idea of life being important, of preserving yourself and your gene line beyond yourself being important, are things which give rise to a sort of natural law in response to the universal problem of the fact that force is necessary for survival. And if you combine those two sorts of things, you start to move towards an idea of something akin to Ten Commandments, to the idea that it's important for human beings to rest, which communist regimes discovered when they prevented people from having their 7-day week, or the fact that it is important for people to have some property which they own and control, to have some say in their choices in life, for the simple reason that someone who is very distant in a central authority might not know what's best for an individual to survive, and that if people are to cooperate, they need to have some degree of choice in life. So the sorts of things which emerge within law, within most countries and most nations, and within most tribes or even religious systems, are often quite similar in certain respects. Just as you might have evolution having certain forms evolve in certain niches time and again, things such as the niche of the crocodile, which at one stage was occupied by a mammal. A mammal type animal in ancient times, or things like the niche of a dolphin, which was once occupied by certain reptiles. So what you have is certain laws generally appearing to deal with certain problems, and those problems where laws tend to emerge or to at least exist by inference are those problems where people would use the use of force if it weren't for the law. Now, anarchists are people who believe not in no laws existing, but are against rulers. So they might look at a system like the system of the ancient Jewish people in the book of Judges and say, well, they had laws, the people would go and stone people outside the city walls for doing certain things, even if they didn't have a king. Though at the same time, the tribes did seem to have leaders within them and figures who had some authority. And you'd also see with most nations, even the small city-states, even ones without official principalities, there are certain families or certain individuals which seem to have some degree of authority. For instance, within the Phoenician state, you didn't quite have people such as Hannibal. They didn't quite have this official status you might expect them to, but they certainly had the status in their family of a degree of authority. Now, I've long argued that law is the culture around the regulation of the use of force amongst those who have the power to regulate the use of force, as in those who have power in the sense of being able to prevent things happening or make them happen without incurring massive consequences for doing so. They have the sort of monopoly in that area. And often you might see that there's a democracy, but there's a certain dynasty which actually controls what the laws will be, or a democracy and a certain oligarchy controls the flow of information so as to preserve a legal system in a certain way. And often enough this can be beneficial to a nation. I'm sure that the United Kingdom would say that their monarchy is beneficial in a way, in that it unites people and keeps people in a specific direction. And in certain nations, democracy has led to massive falls in standard of living and to outright conflict in some cases, wherein you often hear that you can't export democracy. But what's really happened is there's been a change in who governs the use of force to people who might be less effective at governing it towards certain goals, which might previously have existed. So within legal systems within the world, and the more legal systems you study and understand, the more you see they govern similar things and they often have similar solutions. And if they don't have those solutions, you might find legal arguments for why one country rejected one and another accepted it, which is where you might have the Romans having their jus gentium, the idea of the law of the nations, the idea that the nations outside of Rome had common laws that the Romans could then apply to foreigners within Rome, legitimately, for the simple reason that they seem to be just about universally accepted. While murder might be acceptable in certain circumstances in certain nations, what I might call murder might not be deemed murder in Saudi Arabia or China. The idea that the killing of other people should be regulated is certainly a relatively universal concept. And the idea that preventing the illegitimate killing of other people is important is probably just about universal, whether you go to a family or to a tribe or so forth. People other than those with the regulation of the use of force, killing other individuals except in certain circumstances will almost always be frowned upon. And so you do have a sort of natural law which emerges for the simple reason that human beings have a certain genetics. Years ago, I started studying certain court decisions and noticed not only the court decisions, but the arguments of jurists and of philosophers in jurisprudence tend to argue on an emotional basis or on the basis of what is better in a certain sense for humanity or for individuals. You might hear that something is egregious or that it is something which is a foreign concept to this legal system or something like that. And they mean to say that it is so horrible that it seems outlandish or the like. And what you're seeing below that is a sort of emotional language. Interestingly enough, if you look at the various nations of the world, the nations which have the most freedom tend to also have the most expression of emotion. If you look at places where polling has been done of whether someone has felt that they expressed emotion within a certain amount of time, you'll find that the nations which seem to be better off tend to express a lot more emotion, while those which are worse off tend to express less. And Aristotle tends to say that law is reason free from passion, but in a sense, law is that which regulates the outcome of that passion, which is that people would use force if their emotional response to something is strong enough. It's the regulation of that passion. It's the fact that that passion exists, that certain laws are almost inevitable in almost any nation. And if you look at places like the Chads in Seattle, where they set up a sort of Paris Commune, communist state within a state, what almost instantly happened is that a power vacuum emerged and certain people started to enforce the use of force to govern the way things happened. And of course, quite a number of murders happened which were prevented from being solved by this little state being created. And some people alleged that those who were using force were doing so illegitimately, as they would have been doing if they were doing it anywhere else. So the fact that force is almost inevitable due to human emotion means that the use of force and its regulation are both almost inevitable, and a lot of the law we understand to exist is almost inevitable.